The first time I got to interview Slash was back in 2010 for our series Metal Evolution, and we actually interviewed him at the Gibson showroom in Soho in London. And at that time, he was one of the biggest guitar players I had ever interviewed. And admittedly, I was a little bit nervous, but I quickly learned that Slash is this super laid-back guy. We got into everything from Eddie Van Halen to FM radio, and a little-known fact that Slash's first guitar had only one string.
All right.
Okay.
Everybody good?
Cameras are up.
Okay.
Speeding.
You guys got that?
Better.
Slash, take two. Actually, I'd like to start by asking you, take me back to when you first got into listening to rock music. What was the first kind of heavy music that really inspired you?
Well, I mean, it starts really back when I was in England, and my dad is a rock guy, you know, and so, I mean, I lived in England until I was like 5 years old, and I have a really vivid memory of listening to the Yardbirds and the Beatles and the Stones and the Kinks and even the Moody Blues for that matter. But it was all about rock songs and the electric guitar break, the solo section. And so that's what my dad and his brothers were into. And then when I moved to America, it was all about what was going on there. It was still the Stones and all the other English bands, but then you had Hendrix and you had the Doors, Led Zeppelin, you know, that's what my parents were listening to. So I was sort of just raised on it. And then when I got to be about 14, you know, yeah, around 13, 14, I started getting turned on to what you would consider FM radio and stuff that was going on currently. So you're talking Cheap Trick and Aerosmith and Ted Nugent and Black Sabbath and a list of other bands. And I was always drawn to riff-oriented, sort of just heavy stuff. It's just sort of, I never gave it much thought. So when I picked up the guitar, the first guitar I had one string on it. So one string was enough to learn a hell of a lot of riffs, you know? And that's how it started for me. Anyway, so it's always been a part of my sort of musical background, so to speak. Yeah.
I want to ask you, I mean, as a player, and maybe it's just more of a philosophical question, you know, what's the appeal of simply just being able to play loud or playing with a distorted tone? Like, what's the attraction to it for you?
Wow, that's a broad question. No, I think the attraction for playing loud is, I mean, it's perfect for what the attitude that it sort of embodies what rock and roll is. You know, rock and roll to me is about freedom of expression. It's about energy. It's about attitude. It's about youth. It's about like just this, you know, sort of I can do anything I want, and it's almost anti-authority, you know, kind of thing. And let's do it as loud as we can, you know. And I think, I mean, if I could be wrong, but the first real amplified instrument to really go anywhere was the guitar. And it's just, you keep inventing amps that go louder. Why not? You know, make cars go faster. It's the American way. Anyhow, so I think that's the attraction. And then distortion and some of the other sort of effects that we've colored that with just sound cool, you know, and I think distortion definitely adds to the aggression, you know. And then when you think about it, when you talk about sort of like, you know, something especially like Cream, which definitely was one of the early distortion kind of popular in popular music, where distortion really made an impact. And then you think about riffs like Sunshine of Your Love, and then you think about Black Sabbath, and taking the actual idea of what was already heavy and just making it even heavier. So it's all about excess, you know.
I want to kind of hone in on that next chapter you talked about when you were a teenager and getting into bands like Aerosmith.
Right.
And how, I mean, I guess this is what time? This is around the mid to late 70s or something around there?
Well, when I was a teenager, when I picked up the guitar, it was 1980. So right. I first started to become aware of, as a teenager, like your own music that's not your parents'. That was probably 1970, 78, 79, you know? That was around the time. Let's say 77 to start.
I want to ask you about radio, because as we're telling the story, what we've realized is that in the 70s, radio becomes really important for the spread of rock music. Bands like Aerosmith and Kiss and Van Halen are like on the radio like regularly. Was radio a big part of your exposure to music?
Radio was huge. I used to go to bed every night for almost as long as I can remember, from as long as I was living in West Hollywood. I'd have the radio on and I would just leave it on all night. And that's how I slept. And at that time, that was AM radio, and it wasn't until the mid-'70s that my mom actually was like, you should probably start listening to FM radio, which I didn't even know what that was. So I got turned on to FM radio through her. And that's when I first heard, you know, what would be going on at the time, like Aerosmith and Zeppelin. Now, at least on the, I mean, I'd heard Zeppelin before, but as far as the radio is concerned. And it was great, and it's still to this day, I think I listen to radio just because I keep it on all the time. So even when radio sucks, I'm so used to keeping it on, and I just, you know, I do it out of habit. But it's always been sort of the go-to place for music when you don't want to listen to a particular record, or, you know, try and figure out what mood you're in. You just turn the radio on, you know.
So was FM cooler?
FM was definitely cooler. I mean, prior to that, with the exception of Walk This Way, I was listening to, you know, I Write the Songs by Barry Manilow and Jim Croce songs and whatever else was on there, you know.
So, yeah, a lot more to offer on the FM dial.
Yeah. I think when I discovered FM radio, I never listened to AM radio again.
I want to ask you about Van Halen, then I want to move into when Slash enters the picture of rock music. Tell me about Eddie. You know, a lot of people have said that Eddie was the next guy in line after Jimmy to really kind of push the guitar forward. I mean, what, from your perspective, did Eddie contribute?
Well, when I first heard Eddie Van Halen, I mean, I can remember the specific place and where, you know, what, it was on one afternoon, and I was at this elementary school that we used to break into after school was over, and we would skate and race bikes in there, and, you know, so it was this place that we all used to hang out and do freestyle and stuff. Anyway, and Steve Adler, who had just become my best friend around that time, he said, hey, check this out, and he had one of these little Panasonic cassette players and played me a Eruption into You Really Got Me. And it was just like, wow, you know, and the you know, besides just the guitar pyrotechnics, the overall vibe of Van Halen was very energetic and very, very new sounding, very fresh sounding, and it had a ton of attitude. It was just in your face, you know, and so that was pretty exciting. And then it was right after that I started picking up the guitar, and so because I didn't know anything about guitar playing, I didn't really trip out on the technical ability that Eddie had. I was more just impressed with the sonic impact of the whole. You know, it wasn't until later that I started to understand what Eddie Van Halen was about from a technical point of view.
Right. Yeah. I think what's fascinating about GNR too is the fact that when you guys made your initial impact, you were in a sea of glam metal.
Yeah, but,
you know, that was the big thing. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, did you, to what extent did you guys associate with that, or were you feeling like you guys were a lone wolf?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing about the glam scene in LA is, as much as I liked Van Halen, right, the early Van Halen, it was their fault. They brought a certain kind of performance style that really had a huge influence on everything that would come out of LA and the rock scene after that, which I didn't really care for. I was more into Thin Lizzy and Motorhead, that kind of sort of attitude or style or whatever. And although we liked the New York Dolls and we liked the Damned and we liked, you know, what later would be Haunted Rocks and like the Clash and the Sex Pistols and, you know, or even just Johnny Thunders on his own, whatever. So we had that, and it was a genuine passion for that. So what we thought of the LA sort of glam scene was just a lot of posers, because they spent a lot of time getting the look down, but they didn't have any of the sort of rock roots or really knew how to play with that kind. They just weren't genuine. You know, so we were sort of the antithesis of that, and we sort of all came together. And I always say this: we were like the only 5 guys in LA that could have made up that band. There was different configurations of what ended up being Guns N' Roses, me and Izzy, or Axl and I, Steven and Duff and I, or Axl and Izzy and Duff. You know, and all of us, you know, we all knew each other, and we ended up becoming this entity. And so we were. It was definitely us against them in the LA scene. As far as what was going on at the time.
So never tempted to throw on the spandex and pump up the hair and do the makeup thing?
Never did the spandex or anything. Yeah. There was a little bit of makeup in the early days. There was you know, a little bit of hairspray that happened in the very beginning. And there definitely was a glam influence, but it was more from, say, Mark Bolan than it was, you know, like the Bay City Rollers.
Or Cosmo Magazine.
Or Cosmo Magazine, yeah.
It's a hopelessly huge question, but with metal or rock, what ultimately does it mean to you when I say heavy metal or hard rock music? Is it a sound to you? Is it an attitude? Is it a lifestyle? What is it at the end of the day?
You know, hard rock and heavy metal is I actually have used the term lifestyle, and it sounds sort of corny, but there definitely is sort of a lifestyle with it. But I mean, really, when I think of hard rock, I think of a certain kind of abandon, you know, like sort of tossing the rules out the window and just going for it on an emotional level, from a volume point of view, from a sonic point of view, from, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be long hair, but I picture long hair, and it's just like this whole sort of wild and free kind of vibe. When I think of metal, it's that, you know, on steroids. You know, it's the same thing, just a little bit more intense. You know, nowadays it's insanely intense. It's gotten a little to the point now where it's a way of metal is like a way of life for a lot of people that I know, and it's become a culture. But it's great. It's just something that I think that you have to be. It's something that really has to move you, and it has to be honest. You know, that's the most important part. It has to be genuine.